good evening, afternoon, morning, whatever time zone you are, everyone. I'll try to talk to you about our experiences with KLM. The main focus of my presentation is on our response to the COVID crisis, like how we as a union have worked on limiting the fallout, basically. Seeing the contents of the webinar so far, I will try to add some background information about our transnational merger and some of the national mergers as well. I want to start by giving a little bit of background. I'll try to move through that data as fast as possible, and then move on to the interesting, more policy-based parts. So, for starters, a little bit of background. As the FNV, we are the largest union in the Netherlands. We are active in all sectors, not just aviation or transport. We have over 1 million members, and only about 10K of those are aviation members. So about 10,000 members in aviation. We are active in ground handling, cargo, and with the cabin crew. The pilots are and cockpit crew are organized within their own professional union. About 25% workers of the workers at KLM are organized throughout and unionized throughout through the FNV. We are by far the biggest one, so you could say that roughly about 40% of all KLM workers, maybe 50, edging it, if you include the pilots, are organized at a company level. Then a quick look at KLM. KLM is one of the world's legacy carriers. It's the oldest airline in the world. It holds its home base at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. Flies to over 139 destinations, part of SkyTeam, and they merged with Air France in 2003. So this is almost 20 years ago already that this transnational merger happened. I just added there, like to finish the slide, we were highly profitable at KLM for the past couple of years. They've had some rough years, but they were highly profitable for at least 4 to 5 years. And we saw very little of that. Let me focus in on the merger for a second. This happened, well, in 2003. I just turned 18 by then, so I wasn't really involved with the whole process. What we saw in the Netherlands, and a little bit of the history behind this, is that we have no domestic market. We are a very, very tiny country with no domestic market. KLM as a standalone airline really didn't have a future per se. So in order to maintain their network, to maintain a high profile, in order to have a global reach, this merger seemed like a necessity at the time. KLM also came out of a deep crisis at the time, I believe. So the merger was generally seen as something logic. And because it's a transnational merger, it feels like all of the decisions made at the level of Air France don't really affect the KLM crew, and the other way around. We try to treat them still as separate entities. An often heard complaint among our members, though, is like, we are working to keep this company profitable, and all of the profits go to the larger group, and we see nothing. So they do try to blame each other. We have very different union cultures in France and the Netherlands. There's little cooperation, which is a shame. I think there should be, Professor Turnbull was absolutely correct on this, that cooperation between unions is well, key in these kind of matters. We have different union cultures, and believe it or not, like the cabin crew, mostly at KLM, often tries to blame the French unions for any failings within the conglomerate. So we try to educate our members as well, on solidarity between unions, solidarity with other workers. We've tried to do that by showing support during times of action in France and vice versa. That's in all to garner support. In our day-to-day business, we treat KLM as a national company only. And it's enough of a separate entity to be able to maintain that. So like that, it doesn't feel any different than a company belonging to a larger foreign investment group or something like that. So we do treat it as a national company. Yeah, the ownership structure, I'm just going to rush through this, but here you can see that even within KLM, the KLM Air France group, 14.3% is owned by the French state, and the Dutch state reacted recently, like about a year ago, well, before the crisis actually, by buying up more stock in order to have as big a say in the whole process as the French state. So there you can see Dutch government getting involved on a higher level in order to have more control over what happens to KLM as part of the group. I'm going to gloss over this because this is just to indicate the size of the KLM part of the airline, which is about 230 aircraft. But here you can see something interesting, maybe also for the story later on. KLM has subsidiary airlines, most importantly Transavia and KLM Cityhopper. KLM Cityhopper is the domestic European market subsidiary for KLM, and they've been, during this crisis, switching a lot of the KLM flights to KLM Cityhopper because they use smaller aircraft and have cheaper personnel. So they've been already shifting a little, redistributing their workforce to KLM Cityhopper. Same can be said about Transavia, which is the low-cost European airline within the Air France KLM group. Over here, there's also KLM Martinair Cargo. These are cargo-only flights. Martinair used to be a long-haul intercontinental vacation flyer, basically like an airline, and they've been taken over by KLM. I don't remember exactly when, but we did have one of these national merger discussions over there, and to this day there's a group of ground workers that completely identify as Martinair personnel and will have nothing to do with anything that's KLM Blue. We've been able to talk to them and make them like their members, they're active members, but they will never give up their identity, even though they subscribe to the strategy and subscribe to the unity. So identity is a very important part there, to respect the identity of the companies taken over and or disappearing. As a lead-in to our to the response to this COVID crisis, it's good to look at the employment numbers. The total number of employees, which is including the subsidiary airlines, is about 33,000 full-time employees, full-time employment hours, basically. 29K of them are on permanent contracts. 4K of them should be seen as precarious workers. If you look only at KLM, that's in the table below there. In total, there's about 11,000 ground staff, 7,400 cabin crew. And then there's about 6,000 pilots, I believe, and then the rest is divided over the subsidiary companies. As you can see, cabin crew doesn't work with agency contracts. Ground staff does. There's a much higher turnaround because of the lower levels of training among ground staff, and the flexibility that the company claims to need among cabin crew is solved by handing out temporary contract after temporary contract until they no longer legally are allowed to do so. Then, interestingly, the amount of CLAs within the KLM group, just the ones that we are involved in, there's, or partially involved in, there's 8 of them. So there's 8 different CLAs within the same company. These are 8 different collective labor agreements. Only the cockpit ones and the one for the KLC cabin crew are not negotiated by the FNV, because we're not, we don't organize those workers. And all of these CLAs are negotiated by multiple unions. In the case of KLM ground crew, that's the highest number of unions on one table. There's 8 different unions, which is horrible and amazing at the same time. Let's just put it like that. Then on to the COVID crisis. And I hope like this, I can show you a little bit of the inner workings of what happened and what also happens when the state gets involved, and how we try to balance this. On a national level, we bargained, like as the largest union in the Netherlands, we bargained with our government about what the state support should look like. And pretty soon after the COVID crisis hit, there was nationwide support for all businesses affected in their turnover by COVID-19. The deal was that 80% of the wages covered by would be covered by the state, and then in return, the companies would have to keep paying 20% of the wages. And like that, the idea was we can see this crisis out without major job losses. So the relief packages were called the Now. We've had 3 of them, so 1, 2, and 3. Now 1 and 2 had job retention schemes. So there were obligations for employers to keep their workers employed. That was let go in the 3rd package because, well, the crisis kept on and on and on, and it was just not doable anymore. And so now the focus is an obligation to offer reschooling to workers that are being let go, which is a pretty weak one. We're not happy with that, but that's where we're at the moment. In this national scheme alone, KLM received around 1 billion in wage support for those 33,000 workers they have within the KLM group. So they received about 1 billion state support, not alone, state support, just like every other business in the Netherlands. On top of that, KLM got a state loan. I showed you earlier that the Dutch government showed an interest in KLM even before the crisis when they bought up more shares. And they really showed their commitment to KLM as, well, a legacy carrier, as part of the Dutch cultural landscape almost, by investing another 3.4 billion in the KLM group, and that's only for the KLM part. None of this can flow to the Air France part. So this is just support for KLM. The French government took care of the Air France part with, off the top of my head, also like 4 or 5 billion, I think. So the Dutch government is guaranteeing the continuing existence of KLM Group by injecting a loan of 3.4 billion into the company and its subsidiary airlines in the Netherlands. And that loan was subject to conditions. And luckily, social partners were involved in that. We lobbied for it and we got it done. It's a little bit weird that a government would dictate the conditions under which an agreement can be reached, but then again, we were very happy to have this backing from the state government, because the state government dictated that in order to receive the loan, KLM would have to go through some pay cuts of up to 20% for the high earners. Pilots earn a very, very respectable living, as do managers and directors at KLM. So those would be the people paying up to a 20%, taking up to a 20% pay cut. What we got in there was the fact that it was going to be progressive and that low wage workers would be exempt So people that can't carry the burden wouldn't be asked to take a pay cut. In addition, the government wanted to see a 15% cost reduction across all companies. And all of this had to happen in agreement with the unions. So they needed to put forward a bargaining deal with the unions. So it's a pretty strong position for us to bargain in, and pretty good to feel this kind of support on a state level. Because of the COVID crisis, KLM announced redundancies, and I'm just focusing in on ground services and cabin crew here. This happened in 2 rounds. Round 2 is currently happening. Round 1 happened more towards the beginning of the crisis. They needed to cut 2,500 jobs at the ground service level and 1,700 jobs for cabin crew in different rounds. So keep those numbers in the back of your head. 2,500 in ground services, 1,700 for cabin crew job losses as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we did is we made the social plan an integral part of the bargaining table for the state support. So we said no state support without a social plan. So like that, we forced KLM to seriously negotiate a decent social plan with us. A social plan, I don't know if this is the international lingo as well, but this is what we call it in the Netherlands. A social plan is basically a collective labor agreement in which we build a safety net for all workers that are or would be affected by the redundancies, by the restructuring of the company. So we call that a social plan. In the first phase, phase 1, we set up a voluntary leave scheme, which means that people that were thinking about leaving aviation or are close to their retirement could take up early retirement and or like voluntary redundancy, basically. Then we also added career coaching. People could opt for intense career coaching to consider different careers, go and switch to healthcare or like work in different sectors. This is also for people that were already kind of on the fence about aviation, and you try to give them the nudge and point them towards a different career. We set up a generation pact in which older workers either what I just said, like retire early and or start working part-time early, and their places are taken up by younger workers. And we were working on a part-time voluntary leave scheme, which would, for example, mean that when you used to work 100%, you start working 80%, you still get paid 80%, but you build up 100% of your pension, for example. So some benefits towards just going part-time the regular way. This first phase was quite successful. Career coaching, less so. Like it seems people weren't very willing to make a huge switch. So it's in the low hundreds of people that considered a career switch. Then in phase 2, so after you've done everything that we just detailed in phase 1, you start looking at job counseling. So there's not career coaching, but actual job counseling for 6 months for every worker within KLM. While under contract at KLM, you're relieved from your duties as a KLM worker, and you're have the full support of the HR staff at KLM to find a new job of your own choosing. And this can include reschooling, this can include like basically whatever you need to get a new job. After that 6-month period, you're redundant and you exit the company. But the hope, of course, is that within those 6 months, you find a new job. For workers aged 55 and over, this period was extended to 9 months because they generally have a harder time to find jobs on the Dutch job market. Then there was also period of, this also doesn't really quite cut it, but we call it intramural relocation. This is a bad translation from Dutch, but it's basically finding jobs within KLM that people with a particular skill set can still do. And then we extended that to the KLM group. So if, let's say, Transavia as a subsidiary airline was looking for, I don't know, somebody on operations control, and we had somebody with that specific profile redundant at KLM, we would try to make that match. So within the KLM group, we're looking for new jobs. And then if all else fails, forced dismissal with exit pay, like with a bonus on top of the legal required transition payment. And then we have a third phase, because this is a pandemic, which we hope is temporary. A guaranteed return for all workers affected by this within 5 years, with seniority and with your current pay level, at least guaranteed. So those are the three phases that we put forward in our safety net, in our social plan for the workers affected. The results during round one at ground services is that we basically got rid of 300 people too many through the voluntary leave scheme, through early retirements, etc. So that would indicate that there would be about 300 vacancies at that moment. So that was a total success. There had to be no forced dismissals during the first round, because we made it attractive enough for people to relocate, to look for a different career, to exit the company. We made it attractive enough for people to exit voluntarily. Round two, right now, ground crew is hit less hard than cabin crew, because they're already working in a more, we call it a skeleton fashion, like in the bare bones operations. So that would have asked for about 300, and these aren't the exact numbers, this is an estimation, about 300 extra people to be dismissed. Well, those 300 are covered by the surplus we had during the first round. So in total, ground crew, we lost 0 jobs, forced. I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit after this, because there is, this sounds glorious and amazing, but there are a few things that are really painful there that I want to highlight in a second. For the cabin crew, the first round, we were also able to avoid any forced dismissals by early retirements, by replacing people from KLM to KLC to Transavia, etc. Right now, there's the demand for another 500 people to be dismissed. That's still to be decided. We are currently in negotiations about this, and it is looking like there will be forced dismissals in this second round. But it's a far cry from the 1,200 that we were facing initially. I did not enter the last one, because what I just wanted to add in talking about the results is that a lot of the pain that was felt in the ground crew was basically absorbed by the people on precarious contract, the precarious workers, people on temp contracts. They were the ones that were dismissed very easily, and they were the ones with temporary contracts or working through an agency. So that's why the demand for job losses among full-time contractors were a lot lower than in the cabin crew, where there are no agency workers and fewer temp workers. That's about it for my story. I hope that helps. If there's any questions, I will gladly take them. Also, if anybody wants to zoom in more on what we do on the merger level, my knowledge on it is limited, but I can try and answer any questions you might have. So